I'm going to move us into the program. So I hope you're enjoying your dinner and the great conversation. In the years I've been at Alverno, one of the things I've learned is that it's impossible to bring together a room full of educators without partaking in thought-provoking and enlightening conversations about the future of education and politics and many other things. And it's also impossible not to hear good laughter. So thank you all. I look forward to hearing more as we begin our program. So at this time, I'd like to invite Alan Borsuk, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, and Dr. Patrica Luebke to the stage. Tonight, these three will offer us some unique insight into how we can best prepare teachers to serve in urban school environments like those in Milwaukee, and what issues the country's next president should consider when making educational policy. Moderating the discussion will be Alan Borsuk. Alan is a senior fellow in law and public policy at Marquette University Law School. A longtime education reporter, Alan writes a Sunday column on education for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Tonight, he will guide the discussion between Alverno's Dean of Education, Dr. Pat Luebke, and tonight's honoree, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond. Pat began her career at Alverno as an adjunct faculty and the director of the special education program at Alverno. Today, she serves as the dean of the School of Education. She served the Wauwatosa School District in various school administration positions for nearly 30 years. She holds a PhD in urban education with an emphasis on administrative leadership from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. Darling-Hammond is the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University and the president of the Learning Policy Institute, which connects research to policy and practice in the cause of more equitable and empowering learning. At Stanford, she founded the Stanford Center for Opportunity Policy in Education and the School Redesign Network. She also served as the faculty sponsor of the Stanford Teacher Education Program, which she helped to redesign. Dr. Darling-Hammond served as executive director of the National Commission on Teaching and America's Future. The Commission's 1996 report, What Matters Most, Teaching for America's Future, was named one of the most influential reports in U.S. education and led to sweeping policy changes affecting teaching and teacher education. She also led President Obama's education policy transition team and has served on the boards of the Spencer Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and the Alliance for Excellent Education. So welcome to all of you. With that, I'll turn this over to Alan.
I entirely approve of the way the furniture's arranged up here because I don't intend to take the spotlight at all, and we've got a person here who is perhaps the premier figure in American teacher education thinking and study, and we've got the dean of the education school here at Alverno, and I'm eager to facilitate a dialogue between the two of them. And we'll start with Alverno. This book right here came out in 2006, Powerful Teacher Education, Lessons from Exemplary Programs. And it focused on, of which you were the author, along with some support from other researchers. It focused on 7 exemplary programs around the country. One of them happened to be, guess what? Alverno. Why? Why Alverno?
Yeah, I could give you a very long list, but I'll just give you a short list for starters, which is that Alverno really created, long before other universities were paying attention to this, the ability-based curriculum, which is and strategy for performance assessments and for linking theory and practice in schools. in a way that really has been a leader in the country for a very long time. One of the big problems in teacher education historically, particularly when it came to universities in the 1950s from what used to be normal schools, was the divide between theory and practice. Teachers used to take a lot of courses in theory for the first few years of their training. They were supposed to remember all that theory somehow in their head, never having applied it, which flies in the face of everything we know about cognitive science and learning, and then go to a student teaching placement somewhere and, implement that, perhaps in a way that didn't reflect anything they'd learned. And Alverno was way ahead of the pack in sort of challenging that old style of teacher education, building those bridges, and creating an approach that really prepared people to go into schools armed with the tools that teachers need and the commitment, the moral commitment, to use their knowledge and skills on behalf of every child in their classroom.
Still doing it?
We're still doing it. We're still
That's the
doing
good
it,
news.
and we're actually working at getting it better. Some of the work that we're doing in the School of Education this year and going into next year is actually increasing the amount of time that our students spend in the field with seminar work to connect theory and practice even more than it's already done. At this point, our undergraduate education students get a lot of field work, and they teach lessons from the very first field that they do. It's not a situation, as you sometimes see, where the first field work is observing other people. They're actively involved from the beginning. But we've determined, we had a meeting at the beginning of the year that with community, some of you were there, with community, our community partners from schools and school districts, and one of the things that we talked about is what are things that we can do in teacher preparation that will help you get better prepared teachers from the start. And so we're looking at redoing and revamping our field work, and particularly in our senior year, to give students all-day experiences for a longer period of time, and then using our college coursework to help them connect theory and practice. So, yes, we're doing it and we're getting better.
A quote from that book from 10 years ago. I became convinced that a large part of the answer to poor schooling in this country is to understand what strong preparation for teachers looks like and can do, and to undertake policy changes needed to ensure that all teachers can have access to such preparation. So I don't hold you responsible for this, but since you wrote that, enrollment nationwide has plummeted in teacher programs, and teacher preparation programs have taken quite a bit of bashing. What's going on?
Well, some of the plummeting of teacher education enrollments recently has been because there was a huge recession and lots of districts laid off lots of teachers and stopped hiring beginning teachers. And if you were a smart person looking around for what you're going to do in the world, and you see what was happening to teachers in terms of layoffs, you would say, that's not the field for me right now. And so we are beginning to see some increase again. However, the other part of the problem has been really a decade of political teacher bashing, framing the problems of public schools as solely the result of poor teachers, ignoring the growing poverty, homelessness, lack of food security for our children, which has gone on. We've doubled the number of homeless children in this decade. We have more children in poverty now than we did in 1979, almost double the number. We've reduced funding for public schools. In fact, many schools are not spending even what they were in 2008 before they began to slash the budgets, which means lots of other services have been abandoned, class sizes have gone up. So the conditions of teaching have become more challenging. The tendency of some people to blame teachers for all of these other issues that are going on, and to say, well, if we just fired the bad teachers, it would all be better, is also part of the existing challenge that the profession has as a whole. And I think differs from state to state. Wisconsin has been particularly hard hit by the trends that I'm talking about. There's some other states that have put more value and status and investment in teachers, but we have a big job to do to return teaching to the both the kind of support and compensation and investment that it needs to have, and to build a society in which the profession on which all other professions depend is given the support and investment that it needs to do that work.
Supportive audience.
I bet there's some teachers in here. And teachers.
You are, in fact, perhaps the premier advocate of teacher preparation programs in the country. Are there good things happening, even amid these trends of declining enrollment? Are things getting better?
There are some preparation programs in the country which have learned from Alverno and learned from other leading programs and are doing spectacular work. And that's true all across the country. It is more true in some states that make investments than it is in others. But there are a lot of in fact, I do a lot of international work, and I'm finishing a study now of international teacher policies. And a lot of the countries that have really strong support for preparation will tell you they came here to the United States to look at the programs that they modeled their programs after. So we are the innovators, but we don't have the universal support for preparation that other countries do. So although we have many good programs and many that are oriented to continual improvement, we also have some that are very, very poor. And what we don't have are the investments in training teachers. If you were to become a teacher in Singapore or Finland, you would get a free ride to a high-quality preparation program, and you would earn a salary or a stipend while you're in training. And then when you leave that program, you would go into a school where there are senior and master and mentor teachers there to mentor you in those first years. And you would have a long-term prospect of, for example, in Singapore, 100 hours a year of paid professional development time and about 20 hours a week of collaboration time with your colleagues to work on preparing lessons and so on. So we have to also support those aspects of entry and continuation in the field so that we don't have this churn of people coming in and out because the work isn't supported even when they have good skills for the classroom.
Hillsborough County, Florida, which is Tampa. I saw that, I think it's 2 weeks ago, after spending almost $100 million of Gates Foundation money on a teacher evaluation system largely driven by data, which is to say in large part test scores, abandoned that and went back to a more qualitative, kinder, gentler teacher evaluations. What's the moral of that story? $100 million.
Oh, boy. Pat, do you want to answer that question?
I think you're better poised to answer that one.
Well, it seemed, I think, straightforward to people to think, well, of course, teachers' work is all about student learning. We should measure the gains in student learning, and then we'll know whether teachers are effective. That was the idea of this sort of test-based teacher evaluation idea that Gates and some others took up and spread across the country. The problem was it didn't actually work.
Oh, mere detail.
I know. And the policy got way ahead of the research. And I was one of the researchers who actually was looking at this question of teacher effectiveness using these value-added test scores with some of my colleagues. And, it seemed like a logical idea. We were going to study teachers who looked highly effective and find out what their practices were, in contrast to the ones who looked ineffective. What we found was what lots of researchers have found, which is that the people who were labeled effective at one moment in time in one class were not so labeled in another class, and were not so labeled from year to year. There was a lot of instability and unreliability, and we looked deeper in my set of studies at why that was, and it turned out you couldn't actually remove the influence of the changes of the class composition from the way that the gains were made. There are a lot of factors that affect student achievement other than the teacher, who represents about 8% of the total, according to what economists have found. And the test-based teacher evaluation was incredibly unreliable, incredibly unstable, and highly biased against the teachers whose kids either were scoring above the state test ceiling or those who were way behind because there were no questions on the tests to measure their growth. So all across the country, we had federal policy pushing states to implement these test-based teacher evaluation programs, which are now, like in Hillsborough, being rapidly abandoned as the new federal law prohibits the Department of Education or the Secretary from prescribing teacher evaluation because it ran into so many problems in so many communities.
Testing. That's the entire question. How are we doing on that testing, friend? You've written a book about this, and I want to bring Pat into the discussion here,
yes.
too. Too much? Is it useful?
I think from our perspective, there's a role for assessment of students. Certainly there's a role for assessment of students. Whether or not standardized tests are the way to make decisions about student learning is up in the air. One of the things we talked about before was that we really shouldn't be making decisions about student placement or effectiveness of schools or teachers based on one data point. And if everything falls on the results of one specific test on a given date and time, you're really not getting a picture of what it is students are learning. And I think that it's not necessarily that the test is bad, it's sometimes how the test is being used and the purposes for which it's being used that put it at odds with perhaps what it was even intended to do.
So I'll meet your auntie and raise you one. If you look at assessment around the world in high-performing countries, it's not multiple choice. If you look at examination systems in Singapore and the United Kingdom and Australia and so on, kids are writing responses to essays. They're doing open-ended problem sets, and in many of those countries, they're actually doing, as in the international baccalaureate programs and so on, they're doing projects, they're doing science investigations, they're doing inquiries, they're writing papers, and those are part of the examination system. They're scored by teachers, they're developed by teachers, and kids are doing higher-order thinking and problem-solving work. They're not sitting hour after hour trying to find one answer out of 5 and bubbling in.
Right.
And in fact, what happened in No Child Left Behind is that the kinds of assessments we have in this country devolved from some in many states, including Wisconsin, which looked a lot like the ones I described in other countries, to standardized tests that are almost exclusively learning to think about what does the test maker want me to declare as the right answer on this question where I'm bubbling in one answer, what right answer out of 5. Completely unrelated to what you have to do in college and careers. Completely unrelated to the way in which you authentically demonstrate your knowledge in an ability-based context. So it is for us in this country, to some extent, the fact that the tests are pretty bad. They're very low level, they're driving the curriculum in the wrong direction, and they don't predict what people can do in real life. And in fact, at Google, which is right up the street from me, they no longer will look at your test scores when they go to hire you. They want to know, and they used to. They used to collect all that data, they used to make decisions on it, and they did studies, and they found it had no predictive value in a a type of work where what you have to do is find information and figure out what it's worth and weigh and balance and work with others, collaborate to design solutions, evaluate and test your solutions, etc. That's the work of today. So our assessments are antiquated. Multiple choice testing was modern in 1950. It has not been modern for a long time. It is not measuring what we need and care about. And then if you tie high stakes to it and say, if you don't do well on this measure, which by the way is designed to produce a normal curve, and if the wrong kids score well on an item, wrong meaning the ones that are not thought to be the ones who will score high overall, they kick that item out. So they're also biased. So we have all these problems with testing, and we've used them to drive the entire system because we put punishments on them, which they were never designed to be used for teachers, for kids, and for schools. So we are in a very bad situation.
Is it
with
any
respect
better
to
under the new
testing.
federal law?
It can be better because it is now, it depends on what you do here in Wisconsin, because the states will decide. There's still a requirement that you have to have assessments every year in English language arts and math, but you could change them. The law even says the assessments should measure higher orders thinking skills. The law says they can use performance tasks and portfolios. The law says that you don't have to use them, it does not require you to use them for punishments and sanctions. The state could design an accountability system which must have multiple measures. It must have multiple measures, and it can have as many measures as you want. In California, we've got 25 indicators that we're now looking at for how schools are progressing, including things like how many kids of what kinds are getting a college preparatory curriculum, how many kids are getting a career technical sequence that's of high quality, what's going on with respect to school climate. So schools and districts, if their states are wise and progressive, can create a whole child, whole school approach that thinks of the whole mind and the whole person as part of what schools are responsible for doing. Let's see how states respond and how educators educate them to respond.
And I think for us in this state, it then is of critical importance to be on top of and aware of and have input into the way the state is going to
Absolutely.
develop and implement the assessment system in Wisconsin. And so we'll certainly be looking for that to see where thoughtful, well-informed information can be shared, and that it'll be interesting to see who at the state level and who in the community is part of the group that develops our program.
Best as I'm aware, teacher morale in Wisconsin the last few years has been pretty bad for some reasons that are specific to Wisconsin, shall we say, and some that are more
But have
general.
sometimes spread to other states.
Yeah, well, we like to be a national leader.
Yeah.
So I've talked with teachers who say, I would never have my kids go into teaching. What would either of you say to that teacher or to that teacher's kids?
Well, I'm kind of a Pollyanna, I guess. I very much encourage people to go into teaching. I think there are opportunities there for people who want to influence and serve kids and help make the world a better place. And even at my age, I'm still there. I would absolutely encourage my child to become a teacher. And it's interesting here, one of the things we're noticing though, it goes back to the decline in admissions to the School of Education. One of the things that I'm noting, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, is that we have more teacher candidates in our graduate programs than we do in our undergraduate programs. More people coming to teaching as a second career as opposed to the first thing that they do right out of school. And I think that those folks are coming with clearer eyes of what they're facing. And perhaps there are many times people who thought they very much wanted to be a teacher who were discouraged from being a teacher. And now in adulthood and have another career, have decided they're going to follow their path in their heart rather than what they had been told would have been a better career for them. So I'm on the part of, I think there's a lot of good things going in schools. I think we hear way too much about the negative things that are going on in schools. And I mean, I'm happy to work with the people I work with here who are influencing our students and producing really good teachers to serve the kids in our community. So I'm still an eternal optimist.
So I have two daughters who are teachers, who went into teaching, one at the secondary, one at the elementary level. And those of you out there know that those are very different personalities and people who make those choices. Both of whom came home to live with us because they could not afford to buy or rent housing in the San Francisco Bay Area on a teacher's salary. So we had many good years together with everyone. We had a husband in the mix too for a while. And finally, I'll just have to say, what we did was when the market went down in the Bay Area, we said, if you can find a place you can pay the mortgage, we'll pay your down payment. So they both got 2-bedroom townhouses. So they're now, 20 minutes away, which is perfect. But best of all worlds. So I've kind of experienced, the beginning teacher phenomenon as well as what I experienced as a teacher years ago. And I do encourage people to teach. There is nothing more satisfying, nothing more gratifying than what you can do with your kids in a school that is well run and is focused on the mission and so on. I also encourage people, young people and career changers coming into teaching, to be thinking of themselves as taking leadership from the very beginning. Because until educators take back the profession, until they lead and manage, start schools, create pathways to the policy conversation that we're talking about, until that happens, until the profession really acts as a united profession, we're going to have this struggle between the narrow thinking that occurs in some political circles and the conditions we need, not only for teaching to be as satisfying as it can be, but for learning to be as productive as we need it to be.
How am I doing on time? What am I supposed to do here? Somebody tell me. Oh, okay, good. We'll keep going for a while if you let us. But, what goes through your mind when you hear someone saying we got to close the achievement gap?
I think we have to close the opportunity gap.
And amplify on that.
Well, we have great rhetoric about educational equality in this country, but we have never had that reality. And you can go all the way back, to the times of no schools, and then segregated schools, and then unequally funded schools for African American and white students and Mexican American students and others. And then you can look at the school funding systems we have, which are very unequal, where some districts are spending 3 times as much as other districts, and typically it's the more affluent districts that have more resources. You can look at the opportunity gap created by the way in which we treat children in this country, which now I think could be characterized as aggressive neglect. We are among the nations that treats our children more badly than almost any industrialized nation in terms of everything from prenatal care to child care to keeping kids out of poverty, making sure they have homes and food. When you travel the world among industrialized nations, there is almost no poverty for children because the support systems are there, and we have 25% of our kids in poverty. It's unbelievable in the richest nation in the world. So the opportunity gap starts with a set of social policies, is exacerbated by a set of educational funding policies, and then we have other issues about how kids are treated in school. We have to solve that as a whole society, and teachers play a role, but they need for the society to take up the responsibility for funding schools, funding childcare, supporting the pathways of teachers in and to stay, and providing the care for our next generation that other nations routinely provide.
That would have been my answer exactly. And as an example of that, I remember when my youngest daughter was teaching in a city away from here, but one of the things that struck me the most was how much the very supports that you're talking about are left to chance. They're left to they're not viewed as a responsibility of society, but rather a nonprofit agency here. And I remember visiting her in her second grade classroom and feeling tremendous sadness when the high point on Friday afternoon was kids taking home backpacks of groceries for their families. That shouldn't be happening. So that would have been my answer exactly.
I expect we'll make this the last question. Returning to the subject of college-level teacher preparation, some states, Louisiana comes to mind, have been trying to hold universities and colleges accountable for the success of their students when they get out into real schools. Does that work?
I think there are ways that, first of all, I think that teacher education outcomes matter. I think there are the problems I already described of trying to use test-based teacher evaluation as the basis for some of that, but there are other outcomes that you can hold schools of education accountable for, and I think many states are doing that. In California, I chair the Teacher Credentialing Commission. We are surveying all of the graduates of teacher education, both when they leave schools and when they become professionally credentialed a couple of years later after their induction process. And we ask them, did you learn to do this? Were you given opportunities to learn that? Were you prepared for X, Y, Z, and W? And there are big differences in what people say when they've gone through different institutions. And I think we should hold people accountable for preparing folks. We do studies to see whether they perform well in the classroom. When we look at teacher evaluation results in California, they're based on a variety of things other than the value-added concerns that I mentioned earlier. I think it matters whether you go into teaching and stay in teaching, and whether your preparation enables you to do that. So I know from people in Louisiana who hold roles on the same standards board that I hold in California, that they're eager to move away from some of the things they're doing and to expand it in some other ways. But I do think it does matter what schools of education do, and we should expect to hold schools accountable. I think of teacher education as a sacred trust, because teachers are taking on the most important role in this society. They want and need all the knowledge and skills they can have to do right by their kids. No teacher wants to get there unprepared. Everybody wants to be able to meet the needs of each of their children, and teacher education is responsible for that. And so I take it very seriously, and I think we should have ways that are appropriate to hold that high standard for teacher educators.
I completely agree with that, and I would say that it's fair for me to say on behalf of my colleagues in the department here that we want to send our students out as best prepared as they can be to face the challenges that they're going to face and be successful with their students. I can't imagine that a school of ed would want to do anything less. But I agree, and I think it is helpful to know what's happening out there in the classroom, and because the role of teacher today is not the role of teacher 40 years ago, and those standards and expectations will change over time. We need to to keep up with that, and I think it's important to know, what are those challenges that teachers are facing? What is that knowledge and information and skill and dispositional work that needs to be done that may be different than it was 30 or 40 years ago? So I think it's a continuous growth process for all of us.
I regret to say that I think we need to wrap it up at this point, but I suspect I've got something in common with much of the audience, that this is the kind of thing I call fun. That just listening to both of you, and have you come here from California with a stop or two on the way, I understand, is a real treat, and something that we are benefiting from just by the chance to listen to you. So Pat Luebke, Linda Darling-Hammond, thank you, and thank you for the honor of letting me be part of this.